Sondra, why, as you are anthropologist, you become a specialist in gender and feminism?
Well, I don't know which came first. I suppose feminists are very fond of saying that they were probably always a feminist, but I guess I wasn't a formal feminist because of other ideologies that were militating against feminism. I wasn't an official feminist, so to speak, until 1975. I was already in anthropology by that time. I suppose gender was, in a sense, foisted upon me because of particular events that had happened. For example, I was very politically active in various groups, and was always a leader in these groups. But I was never president or chair. I was always secretary. And I got together with...
You like the work, not the honors.
Exactly. So I started comparing notes with other women who were in the same situation on the left. And this was the beginning of the second wave of feminism. But also I had been in Sudan. I had already been living in Sudan. And unlike most of the stories that anthropologists tell who work on gender, instead of talking about the terrible oppression of women in Sudan, I will say that the first feminists that I met in my life, the bravest women I met in my life, were Sudanese women. And it had quite an impact on me in terms of my activism and my thinking about gender and so on.
What do you think about the idea, the Western idea about gender and feminism?
Well, first of all, I refute the idea that feminism is only a Western concept, or even that it was started by Westerners, dominated by Westerners, maybe, only because for epistemological reasons, that is, who has the power to make their feminist voice known. Well, the West has the power of the publishing and dissemination of information and so on. But there's indigenous feminism that until very recently was basically ignored by Western feminists. And indigenous feminists all over the world who were not Western were pretty much ignored. Even Latin American feminists were ignored, I think, by Northern American feminists for a very long time.
You must know that, for instance, in the 60s, during the Algerian Independence War, the veil had the meaning of a protest instrument against the Occident. According to these situations, do you consider that from the Western thinking, with different ideas about religion, about family, is possible to understand the situation of the Islamic world?
Well, apparently it hasn't been possible for the West to understand the Islamic world, since we seem to be at odds with the Islamic world unnecessarily, I think. And the veil has very much been centered. I agree with you that the meaning of the veil has changed over the centuries. It is different from one country to the next. It is different in terms of individual women and why they wear the veil. I decided at some point to talk to some Sudanese women about why they were wearing the hijab. And I think I was given something like 25 different reasons. I put it on the UCLA website at some point as some sort of example of how we try to oversimplify this form of dress. But as a feminist, I will have to say that the veil is something that, when it's imposed on women, certainly I don't accept it, but it's not my place as a Western woman, as a foreigner, or whatever, to say what's acceptable or not acceptable.
When we see that at the same time women use some ideas of the Islamic religion in order to defend her position, we can see that the problem is not the religion. The problem is the power of men in that society.
A number of writers in the Middle East have written about how it's patriarchy and not religion, that the system of patriarchy, which preceded Islam and Judaism and Christianity, to name the three messianic religions, and that patriarchy ties the power up, and in terms of laws, in terms of custom, in all sorts of ways. But it can be justified because the Quran is rich, and the sayings of the Hadith are rich. And so one can always find some justification of any kind. That is, men can find justification for their rule, for their dominance of women. But in more recent years, women have been looking for passages in the Quran and so on to justify women fighting for their equality and occupying different places.
Let's switch to situation in Sudan. How did you start to work on this country?
Well, it's not a very political or academic explanation. I married a geographer who was going to be doing his PhD in Sudan. And I knew nothing about Islam, nothing about Africa, nothing about the Middle East, certainly nothing about Sudan or Khartoum. So I was thrust into an entirely new situation, which I took to immediately, and became very intellectually and politically engaged in Sudan. I met my first communist in Sudan, my first feminists, the first of many things. I learned about colonialism firsthand. Sudan had only recently been independent, and there were many colonial residuals. I encountered different forms of racism than I had worked on in the States. I had been a civil rights activist. But the forms that racism took in Sudan were entirely different for me at the time. So I had an instant education. I would say within the first few months, I was soaking in a whole new life. And then the moment of truth came in which we actually had to leave Sudan. So I tried to figure out a field that I could go into that would take me back to Sudan. And African Studies was my MA degree, and then anthropology, two very good fields that would return me to Sudan. But as you can tell, there were many political and intellectual interests that grabbed me and took me back over and over again.
How do you see the political situation in all the Africa? Some years ago, we thought that it was a lost continent, and now we are speaking about the continent of the future, no?
I would put an earlier stage where we thought it was promising when I was in African Studies, because all of the independence movements were taking place, and it was extremely exciting. And then we went through this long period of decades of thinking that it was a lost continent in the true sense of the word, economically and so on. And now I agree with you that there are big reasons for thinking otherwise. But the political situation in Sudan is not a hopeful one. As you know, the South Sudan, Southern Sudan, seceded from the North in 2011. And that was a big blow for everyone. One of Sudan's most famous and absolutely best guerrilla leaders, John Garang, was killed just before the just before the secession, actually, or before the election that brought on the secession. Wanted a unified socialist Sudan. And hope was building up that, in fact, that was going to be the case. But for various really complicated reasons, and his death didn't help. I mean, we don't like to think how one person could actually have such an impact on the political future of a country. But it seems so in the case of Garang. Had he stayed true to his principles, he had an enormous following. And it was possible. There was some hope. Now the situation is it's very dim for both countries, because there's the oil is in the south and the pipeline is in the north. And that has set up the north and the south after the independence of South Sudan to be great antagonists. And also, they're still fighting over the border areas that are undefined. I mean, it doesn't matter how the West has drawn these boundaries, or even how the Sudanese government has, and South Sudan government, how they have drawn these boundaries. People are not observing those boundaries. And so we have, on the borderline between North and South, mixed families, many, many mixed families, thousands of mixed families. And they don't even know where to identify.
Something like North Korea and South Korea.
Yes, very similar.
I know that you were an activist in the conflict and the problem between Israel and the Arabic countries. I would like to know your opinion about the future of this issue.
I'm an activist on behalf of Palestinians. In the United States, this is one of the most unpopular forms of activism one could engage in. I think far, far wiser people than I have attempted to give the prognosis for the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I think that if the U.S. could step out of its guardian angel relationship with Israel, that might be a first step. For those of us working on behalf of Palestinians, it's a most misunderstood position, because it gets interpreted as anti-Israel, and then it gets interpreted as anti-Jewish. And so people who work on behalf of Palestinians are called anti-Semites. Well, that's always interesting anyway, since Arabs are also Semites, but that's another matter. And, you know, we try to explain that this has to do with Israeli government policies, not with Israelis per se. We just have a history, once again, of the conflict of land use, the conflict of ownership, that gets supported on both sides by religious documents. So I don't see any immediate alleviation of this conflict.
Sondra, as a way to end this conversation, I would like to know your opinion about the global protest movements over the last 2 years in different parts of the world, especially in Europe and in the Middle East countries with the Arab Spring. At this moment, it is possible to consider that the results have failed to meet their expectations. Do you share this pessimistic view, or do you believe that they will eventually result in a growing social and political participation?
I think that that these movements will continue to grow. We've been seeing this kind of more grassroots, more people-oriented, more fragmented, less ideological movements, even with these Zapatistas in Mexico. The forms that these new movements have been taking, which are postmodernist, really, and post-colonial. And I agree with what you said a minute or so ago, and that is that they're not only do they involve very different people, a diversity of people, diversity of classes, and the people themselves, but also a diversity of ideas and a diversity of strategies. And the strategies are so different. They're so much more creative. They're so much more playful. I mean, this is what they've taken from post-colonialism and postmodernism, that there's not this sort of teleological moral end. It's not like, although I still identify as a Marxist, it's not like the Marxist movements. It's not like the feminist movements where there's kind of a moral end. And we don't see that in these anarchist influenced movements, we see that the moment of standing up to authority becomes important in and of itself. Not an end, but an important moment. And I think it's difficult for those of us of your generation and mine to be able to see that they might succeed. And I even think the word succeed is probably not the right word, but to move forward. Not all of them. But you know, once these people have revolted in the streets, they're forever changed. And even though they may go back to their houses, the revolution is in their hearts, and they're going to change their kids. And that's where the big change is going to be from my point of view.
Yes, I agree with you. Thank you, Sondra. It was very important for us to have you in this emission, and I hope in the future visits we'll be together again.
I hope so. It's my pleasure, and I always learn a lot from these kinds of exchanges and conversations, so thank you.
Okay, thank you to you. Thank you very much.